Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are once again cooperating with Chords. We're talking about fonts and the document options specifically today. So let's go ahead and open the document options, and we're going to look for the fonts pane. And you'll see that Chord Symbols has its own little category here, the last one here. And when we use this pull-down menu, we see that we have 4 different options here. So let's start with the symbol options. Now you can set that see that this is already set to Times New Roman 12 plain, but we can very simply change this. Actually, let's go here into this casual font here, and we're going to make this a little bit larger because this casual font is a little bit small. And we'll click OK and click Apply. And you'll see that the chord roots and the alternate chord names have been converted to that new font. The slash character has also been converted, so that also affects that particular character as well. However, everything else has not been affected, including the suffixes, including the alterations and everything. So let's go back there and talk about the next option, which is suffix. Now the suffix has a asterisk here, and the asterisk says will only affect items created after font changes are applied. Existing items will not be changed. So when I go ahead and change this font to the casual, and again we'll make this a little bit larger. Let's make that 13. Oops, 13. What's going to happen is that nothing's going to happen in the file. All of the suffixes will remain the same, right? So we're going to have to deal with this in a separate way, which I'll show you pretty soon. So again, the changing the suffix there will only affect suffixes that are created from this point on. It's not going to change the suffix that already exist. And then the next thing here for alterations, now this is the music font. This will affect the flat, sharp, and natural sign when it's used with the chord roots or the alternate bass notes. So if I change this to, let's say I'm going to go to, instead of Maestro, I'm going to go to my jazz font here. And you know what, we'll make this a little bit smaller, like that 14. And when we hit apply, what you'll see that is that it will affect the sharp here in the alternate bass note. I don't have any sharps or flats in the chord roots here, but it would change those as well. The other place that it would change is if, for example, you have a suffix that uses this prefix here. Now, all of these suffixes in the default document do the sharps and flats as individual characters now. I think this used to be something, they used to do this differently in the old versions. But if you have this number 5 with a prefix and you set the flat, this flat symbol will also be affected by that alteration font that you set there. But as it is, none of the suffixes in the default document use that prefix like that. So it's sort of a little bit irrelevant to that point unless you're using that in your custom chord symbols. And then finally, the last option there for the fonts has to do with the fretboards. Now this is the Seville 36 plain. Now this is a throwback to the old way that Finale used to do fretboards, which were just individual characters from a font set, in this case the Seville font set. They've since changed this, so this is sort of an irrelevant option. I don't even know that there's an alternate that you can change this to that would actually give you fretboards anyway, so it's sort of a moot point. But again, that's just sort of an old way of doing it, so you don't really need to deal with that. And okay. So now what we need to deal with is the suffixes, because as I mentioned, when you change the suffix font in the document options, it won't change the existing ones. In fact, all of your suffixes here will remain with that Times New Roman font, and also with the Maestro music character for the flat and sharp symbols will remain here as well. So how in the world would you go through and change the fonts for all of these chord suffixes at once? You can imagine it would be a huge undertaking to go through every single one, edit it, change the font of the M character, and then change the font of the A, and then the J. I mean, it would just be, that's insane to even do that. Fortunately, Finale provides us a little utility to help out with this, and it is the Change Chord Suffix Fonts option here in the chord menu. And we get this little helpful utility, which is literally just a font replacement for the chord suffix library, right? And the way this works is that it will search for a specific font, or in this case, I have all fonts checked, and it will replace it with whatever font that you set. Now, you do have to be careful about using the all fonts. In fact, I would not recommend doing that at all because then it would replace the text fonts and the music fonts, which would sort of be disastrous for you. So there's almost no reason to ever use all fonts there. So what we want to do is use selected fonts. And now you can see that since I changed the default font, Finale is actually putting those default fonts in here by default for me. But I know that this is not what I want to do. In fact, I happen to know that most of the text fonts in the suffixes are set to Times New Roman 11. So what I want to do here is set the font that I'm searching for to Times New Roman 11. So let's go find that. If I can, Times New Roman 11. Click OK. And now you'll see that it says Times New Roman 11, but the size is not checked. So be careful about how you're doing this and what you're choosing to do here, because if you have the size checked, it will search for this specific font at this specific size. If you don't have it checked, all it's doing is searching for Times New Roman font and replacing it with whatever you have checked. So, and then if you have size checked here but not here, basically what you're doing is replacing all Times New Roman font with all casual 13, right? If you replace it like this, then you're replacing all Times New Roman with casual at whatever size it happens to be. So there's a bunch of different options here, and my recommendation is to be very specific about it. So in this case, what I want to do is replace Times New Roman 11 plain with casual, I'm going to call this 12, not 13, casual 12 plain, right? So I've got all of these things checked, so I know that Times New Roman 11 plain is going to replace by casual 12 plain, period, end of story, right? The options here at the bottom, so the fix chord suffix spacing. So as you may know from the chord suffix editor video I did, every single character gets its own units in the chord suffix editor. And when you press the next button, Finale automatically creates an appropriate horizontal offset for each character. Now, without this checked, Finale is going to use whatever you have set for each of those characters as it is. When you check the fixed chord suffix spacing, Finale is going to recalculate all of those spacings based on the new font that you're using, in this case, Casual 12 Plain. Now, again, every single text font has its own sort of width and its own size and everything, and actually if you change the size to something dramatically bigger, you're going to need a lot more space between the characters. So I would recommend definitely having this checked, otherwise you're going to end up with some weird results in the suffixes and the spacing not be quite right. Now the fixed baseline position is something different. You know that each of those characters has a vertical offset as well. But by checking fixed baseline positioning, you're going to reset every single character and every single chord suffix the vertical offset to 0. That's what this will do. Now, in certain circumstances, you don't want to do this. In fact, if you remember me creating the 7 flat 9 flat 5, where the flat 9 and the flat 5 are in parentheses and on top of each other, the only way I was able to do that is to create different vertical offsets for the flat 9 and flat 5 characters. So I had to do something other than 0. If I were to check this and I had those types of chords in my library, they would get completely ruined because all of the baselines would be set to 0. So, again, my recommendation is check the first one, don't check the second one. All right? And so we've got all that set, and basically what I'm doing is replacing Times New Roman 11 with Casual 12, and check OK. And you'll see that now all of my suffixes have been converted to that casual font, right? Now what you notice is that I'm using the Jazz font for the alterations for the alternate bass notes and the roots here, but I still have the Maestro font set for the characters in the suffix, right? So let's go ahead and fix that. But we kind of need to know what we're looking at. And in this default document, there's a couple of things going on here. So if I edit this suffix and go over to that flat character, you'll see that the font here is Maestro Percussion 14 Plain, right? What's interesting is that sometimes they use the Maestro Percussion 14, and sometimes they use the plain Maestro font. The sharp symbol is Maestro Plain. So unfortunately, we actually have to go through and replace both of those fonts in the chord suffix, Change Chord Suffix Fonts utility here. So let's do the first one. So we're going to find Maestro Maestro Percussion 14 plain. If I can find this here, Maestro Percussion 14 plain. And what I'm going to do is change this to that jazz. So many fonts. Jazz, we'll go with 13. That's okay, I think. Change it with that. All right, so now Maestro 14 plain is being converted to Jazz 13 plain. Click OK. And you'll see that the flat sign has now been changed, but the sharp sign has not. So now you got to go through Change Chord Suffix Fonts, and we're going to search for Maestro. Somewhere here, Maestro 14 plain. And we're going to look, replace that with Jazz 13 plain, if I can find it. There it is, Jazz 13. All right, so now we're replacing the other one, the Maestro character. And now my sharp has been converted. So, you know, it's sort of a long process to go through this, but if you really wanted to change your chord suffixes and your chords to a different font like this, that's really the only way to go through and do this. You have to do it character by character, piece by piece. Now, one thing you notice, I'm scrolling down to the bottom of the page here, is that I do have this one font, special font that I created. It's that flat 9, flat 5 font that I was, chord suffix that I was talking about. And you'll notice that the 9, the 5, and the 2 flats have not been changed, right? So if we look at this, it will kind of become clear why. The flat character is Maestro 10 plain. The 9 is Times New Roman 8 plain, right? The B for the flat 5 is Maestro 10 and Times New Roman 8 plain, right? So because I went through and specifically chose a specific size to replace, it did not touch these Times New Roman 8 fonts or the Maestro 10 fonts, right? So if I needed to fix this as well, then I'd have to go through and do that 2 more times, replacing the Times New Roman 8 with, say, Casual 9, and the Maestro 10 with, say, Jazz 9 or something. So again, you'd have to do this all piecemeal like that in order for this to work. All right. So I want to talk about another option in the chord menu here, having to do with substitute symbols. Now this is very limited in scope, this option here, and what it has to do with is, you know, when you type the letter B in Finale, you'll get the flat sign. When you type the pound sign, you'll get the sharp, and when you type the O, you'll get the diminished chord. When you type the percent sign, you'll get the half diminished chord. And when you type Option Shift equals, you'll get the triangles for the major 7 chord. So essentially, what Finale is doing is it's replacing the text font. In this case, the O. It's replacing with the O from the Maestro music font, and same thing with the percent sign and the delta sign for the major 7. Now, what's weird about this is that it's really only the half diminished symbol that's affected by this, and it's sort of technical, but the O and the diminished symbol sort of exist in the same slot between the text and the music font, as does the delta symbol and whatever that is, the plus equals that you type to get this. They all exist in the same slot, the same font slot, and the same applies to the flat, the sharp, and natural, and all that stuff. So technically it's not really replacing. However, except for the half diminished, you know, if the half diminished font symbol is in slot 35, but the percent sign symbol is in slot 64, then it needs to convert 64 to 35. That's literally all this is doing. So without this checked, it's really weird because everything will work perfectly fine. The O will work, the Option Shift equals will work, but the percent sign won't. It's literally the only thing that's being affected by that. So again, it should actually say substitute symbol here, because it's really the only thing. Now there is something funky with those particular symbols specifically, and I've opened up a default document that uses the Broadway Copyist font. Now the Broadway Copyist font for chords uses a font called Finale Copyist. If I type in a C, you'll see it's a little bit a little more handwritten like that. And for some reason, the Finale Copyist font uses its own characters for the diminished, half diminished, and just the diminished and half diminished symbols actually. So typing O doesn't really do anything for you. In fact, it won't recognize it because it's not actually replacing it, because there is a character within the Finale Copyist font that is the diminished symbol. And in this particular file, in this particular font, you have to type something differently, and that is the backtick key, which is the key that's just to the left of the 1. And you'll see that it will type the diminished chord in directly. There's no replacement going on there. And the same thing with the half diminished symbol, which is not the percent sign, but it is option dash, which I guess is the N dash technically. And you'll see that it will directly put in that half diminished symbol. Again, this is because the diminished and half diminished symbols exist directly within the Finale Copyist text font, right? It's a special font that comes with Finale that's used just for this Broadway Copyist font file. However, there is no major 7 chord, major 7 suffix or character that exists in this font. In fact, if we go into the chord suffix selection dialog box, there is not a delta symbol, triangle for the major 7 to be found anywhere. So that is one limitation of this particular font style for chords. You can, of course, create your own and use it from the Maestro font and go about your day that way, but just be aware that the major 7 chord does not exist by default in this particular style of file. And then finally, let me go back to the document options a little bit here. I do want to talk about some of the things that exist for in the chords menu here. There's not a whole lot, so it should be easy to go through. Now, the chord alteration baseline adjustment numbers here, these are literally the vertical adjustments that you can make for the alterations to the chord roots and the alternate bass notes. So it literally it will affect this this sharp, how high or how low it is. So depending on what you set there, you can raise and lower those symbols. So there's independent ones for the sharps and the flats and the natural signs. Now, incidentally, chords by default usually don't show the natural after the root. Like you wouldn't show D natural 7. You just D7 is it works just fine. The only time you would ever see a natural in that situation is if you were to switch your chord style to European. Now, the European style does use the natural sign in front of the B and only in front of the B. So again, that's really the only time you would ever see that natural sign in that manner. And you do have the option to adjust the baseline if you need to. So document chord size. Scale all chords and scale all fretboards. This will allow you to literally scale everything all at once, the chord roots, alternate bass notes, and the suffixes as well, all in one shot. Now, we can do this number, let's say we're going to do this 110%, you'll see the chords get just a little bit bigger. Now, there's a big problem with this scale all chord situation. If I do something extreme here, like 180%, and I hit apply, what you're going to see is something awful. You're going to see that the suffixes are all suffocating. And there's a very specific reason that bugs me. I think it's a sort of a bug in Finale that has to do with the way that it scales texts. And this is not the only place this exists. It happens in other places in the program as well. What's happening is that Finale is scaling the size of the font itself, but it's not scaling the size of the spacing, which is a real problem, as you can see, because you need more space when the fonts are larger, and it's just not doing that. So again, it's a bug. It's a pet peeve of mine. I really hate that it doesn't do that, but that's what it is. And so for my money, this scale all chords by value here you really ought to keep this within a range of about 85% to about 115%. At 85%, it does get a little, it starts to get a little spaced out with the suffixes, but it's not too bad. And 115%, they just start to get a little bit squished together, but you can kind of get away with it. Anything outside of that range, it really does start to look really strange. In fact, if you go really small too, you'll see the suffixes get really far spaced out, which just doesn't look good. You don't have the same problem with the fretboards. The fretboard is just a diagram, and the diagram will get larger or smaller as much as you want. So, 150% is just fine, although you have to deal with the spacing, of course, or 50% is just fine. So you don't have that same limitation with the scale fretboards. And then finally, lastly, the only thing left here is the music characters. And this is literally telling you what character from the font set you're using for the flat sign for the alterations. In other words, for the chord roots and the alternate bass notes. There really is probably no reason to change this, but you could, instead of seeing D flat 7, you could have it say, I don't know, D parentheses flat 7 or something, and this is how you would change it. But I don't necessarily see the value in doing something like that, but the option exists. And I think that's it. I've been talking for a long time. There's a lot to cover here. Chords and fonts is a little bit confusing, particularly with the suffixes and how that works, but hopefully I've explained that well enough, and you'll be okay from here on out. All right, so thanks for watching. Come back. We have a few more videos on cooperating with chords, and I will see you soon on the next video.